Well, they never expected the neuroscientist to stop asking questions halfway through the interview. They never expected the behavioral analyst to close your file without writing a single conclusion. They never expected the psychologist, someone who had spent 30 years decoding the human mind, to admit there was something about you he simply couldn't explain. At first, they thought you were just another complicated person, someone with unusual habits, someone carrying hidden trauma. But the deeper they looked, the stranger everything became. Every answer created two new questions. Every attempt to understand you seemed to erase the certainty they walked in with. So they abandoned science, they abandoned logic, and they called the one man who claimed he could see what ordinary eyes never could, a psychic. A man who had spent decades reading people no one else could understand. He had never walked away from a session, until he met you. The moment he reached for your energy, his expression changed. His hands began to tremble. The room turned silent, and before anyone could ask what he had seen, he whispered, "No human should have this kind of power." But the terrifying part wasn't what he saw. It was what saw him. Before we uncover what really happened inside that room, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why some people are never meant to be fully understood. They believed they were prepared. After all, this wasn't their first unusual case. Over the years they had investigated people with extraordinary memory, unbelievable intuition, impossible emotional control, and personalities that refused to fit inside normal psychological categories. Eventually every mystery had found an explanation. Every exception had become another case study. At least, that had always been true until your name appeared. Nothing about your life looked extraordinary on paper. No public achievements that demanded attention. No dramatic history anyone could point to. No mysterious background. If someone passed you on the street, they'd probably forget your face before reaching the next corner. Yet somehow, people never forgot the feeling you left behind. Some described you as calming. Others admitted you made them strangely uncomfortable. A few said they felt completely exposed around you, even when you barely spoke. None of them could explain why. That inconsistency became the beginning of the investigation. At first, they assumed it was charisma, then emotional intelligence, then advanced pattern recognition. Every theory sounded convincing, until the evidence quietly destroyed it. The psychologist noticed something unusual first. Most people reveal themselves without realizing it. Tiny movements, micro-expressions, changes in breathing, shifts in eye contact. The unconscious mind leaks information constantly. It always has, except yours didn't. Not because you were hiding. Not because you were pretending. There was simply nothing leaking. Your emotions weren't suppressed, they were organized. You didn't react because someone expected you to. You reacted only when something genuinely deserved your attention. That single observation disturbed him more than he admitted. Healthy people don't usually operate like that. Neither do damaged people. You seem to exist somewhere neither category could describe. The investigator approached from another angle. He interviewed people who had known you for years. Friends, coworkers, family, former classmates, complete strangers. Instead of finding one consistent version of you, he found 20. One person called you incredibly kind. Another described you as intimidating. Someone insisted you never spoke. Someone else claimed you could hold a conversation for hours. Some believed you trusted too easily. Others were convinced no one had ever truly earned your trust. The contradictions became impossible to ignore. It wasn't that people misunderstood you. It was as if everyone met a different version. Yet none of those versions were fake. Each one was somehow real. That wasn't normal. Then came the behavioral specialist. He studied hours of recordings, body language, walking patterns, reaction speed, eye movement, voice frequency. He expected hidden habits to reveal themselves. Instead, he noticed something almost impossible. Whenever someone entered the room carrying dishonest intentions, your posture changed before they spoke, not dramatically. Just enough, a slower blink, a slight adjustment of your shoulders, a tiny shift in attention, almost like your nervous system recognized something your conscious mind hadn't processed yet. Coincidence, that's what he thought. Until it happened again, and again, and again. Eventually he stopped counting. You consistently reacted to deception before deception revealed itself, not perfectly, but far too often to dismiss. No scientific model could explain it. Still, they refused to believe anything extraordinary was happening. There had to be an answer. There always is. Weeks became months. The investigation expanded. Every specialist arrived with confidence. Every specialist left carrying uncertainty. One neurologist even admitted something that made the room uncomfortable. "I understand how the brain predicts patterns. But this isn't prediction." No one answered him. Because nobody wanted to say out loud what everyone was secretly beginning to suspect. Maybe they weren't studying your mind anymore. Maybe they were standing in front of something that refused to be measured. That's when someone proposed an idea nobody took seriously. What if this isn't psychological? Silence. The room felt smaller. Not because anyone believed it, but because nobody could completely reject it either. The suggestion sounded irrational, embarrassing, almost laughable, yet logic had already exhausted itself. Every scientific explanation had reached the same dead end. And when human beings run out of certainty, they become willing to ask questions they once mocked. 3 days later, a new name appeared on the schedule. Not a scientist, not a doctor, not a professor, a psychic. Someone whose reputation had survived decades of criticism because, somehow, he kept being right. Even skeptics admitted one uncomfortable truth. He noticed things no one had told him. He described people he had never met. He uncovered secrets nobody believed he could know. Most considered him gifted, others called him dangerous. But everyone agreed on one fact: he never refused a reading. Not once. Until the day he agreed to read yours. He entered the room with complete confidence. He smiled, joked with everyone, placed his worn leather bag on the table, removed a small cloth, a few strange objects, a notebook. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. He looked exactly like a man who had repeated the same ritual thousands of times. Then someone quietly placed one object in front of him, something that belonged to you. He reached forward. His fingers touched it, and everything changed. The room stayed quiet, not because anyone expected something dramatic to happen, but because professionals learn to respect silence. The psychic closed his eyes for only a moment. His fingertips rested lightly against the object. Normally, this was the easiest part. A simple connection, a familiar routine. Thousands of readings had begun exactly this way. He would pause, breathe a smile, and then start describing details no stranger should possibly know. That was how people became believers. That was how his reputation had been built. But this time, nothing happened the way it was supposed to. His breathing stopped, not intentionally, instinctively, like his body had forgotten what came next. The smile disappeared from his face, his fingers stiffened, his shoulders locked. For several long seconds, no one moved. One of the observers finally cleared his throat. Is something wrong? The psychic didn't answer. His attention remained fixed on the object resting beneath his hand. Not because he was concentrating, because he couldn't pull away. It felt as though something invisible had already noticed him. Slowly, very slowly, he lifted his hand. His eyes opened. But they weren't looking at the people inside the room anymore. They looked through them, like someone searching for a doorway no one else could see. He stopped speaking, swallowed, then tried again. I've never felt anything begin like this. The investigators exchanged uncertain glances. One of them leaned forward. What do you mean? Instead of answering, the psychic asked his own question. Who is this person? They looked confused. You've already been told. No. His voice became firmer. I know the name. I want to know who they really are. A silence answered him. Because none of them knew. That was the entire reason they had invited him. The psychologist folded his arms. We were hoping you could tell us. The psychic slowly nodded, then looked back toward the object. No, you were hoping I'd confirm what you already believed. The room instantly became uncomfortable. No one spoke. Because deep down, he was right. Every person sitting there already carried an opinion about you. Some believed you were emotionally detached. Some believed you were hiding something dangerous. Others believed you were simply gifted. Nobody had arrived without expectations. The psychic could feel those expectations pressing against the room. But none of them matched what he was sensing. He reached forward again. More carefully this time. His fingertips barely touched the surface. Immediately, his entire body flinched. Not violently. Just enough for everyone to notice. He removed his hand as if touching ice instead of warmth. What happened? Someone whispered. The psychic stared at his own fingers, almost expecting to find a mark. There should be movement. He murmured. There should be memories. There should be emotional residue. There should be something. But he stopped. Their psychologist frowned. Silence. The psychic nodded slowly. Not empty silence. Protected silence. Nobody understood what he meant. He reached inside his bag, this time removing a small pendulum, an ordinary object, one he had trusted for decades. He held it above the table, waited. Normally it began moving within seconds. Tiny circles, gentle swings, almost alive. Today it didn't move. Not even once. He frowned, adjusted his grip, tried again. Nothing. One investigator laughed nervously. Maybe it's just an off day. The psychic ignored him. Instead, he picked up a deck of old cards. The edges were worn from years of use. He shuffled slowly, calmly, methodically, then placed 3 cards face down. His breathing had become noticeably slower. He flipped the first card. His expression didn't change. He revealed the second. His eyebrows tightened. Then he turned over the third. Everything stopped. His face lost color. His jaw remained slightly open. No words came. Only silence. The psychologist leaned closer. What do you see? The psychic never looked away from the cards. I'm seeing... That can't be right. He reshuffled. Again, different cards, different order, different method. The result stayed the same again, and again. Final again. He pushed the entire deck away. I've never seen this before. The room grew heavier. Someone asked quietly, what is it? The psychic looked directly at them. You brought me here to read someone. Instead, it feels like something is reading me. No one laughed, not this time, because his voice carried something impossible to fake. Fear, not panic, not imagination, recognition. He stood up and began pacing slowly, trying to organize thoughts that refused to organize themselves. I've worked with grieving parents. I've read violent criminals. I've sat across people who carried darkness their entire lives. Never step back. But this, he stopped walking. This feels different. The investigator folded his notebook shut. Different how? The psychic looked toward the door, almost instinctively. As if, I'm being watched. Everyone turned. The hallway outside remained empty. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Yet somehow, the room no longer felt empty. The temperature hadn't changed. The lights hadn't flickered. Nothing supernatural announced itself. And somehow, everything felt different. The psychic rubbed both hands together, trying to steady them. They're not hiding from me. They're simply refusing to let me pass. The psychologist frowned. The psychic immediately realized what he had said. His expression hardened. I shouldn't have used that word. You heard something? No, I felt something. What? He hesitated. Long enough that everyone noticed. Finally, he answered. Permission. The room fell completely silent. What do you mean? The psychic looked toward the object one last time. Every instinct told him to leave. Every year of experience told him to end the session immediately. Yet curiosity, that dangerous human curiosity, pulled him forward. He slowly reached for the object one final time. This time, he whispered, I'm going deeper. His fingertips made contact, for less than 2 seconds. Then, his chair slammed backward across the floor. His breathing turned ragged, his eyes shot open with genuine shock. He wasn't looking at the object anymore. He was staring into the empty corner of the room, as though someone else had just arrived. The corner of the room was empty. At least, that's what everyone else saw. The investigators turned their heads. The psychologist narrowed his eyes. One assistant even stood up and walked toward the wall, expecting to find someone hiding behind the half-open door. There was nothing except silence. Yet the psychic hadn't moved. His breathing had become shallow. His pupils remained fixed on the same empty space, as though someone invisible had stepped into the room and claimed it without making a sound. For the first time in decades, he questioned his own senses. Not because he doubted what he had felt, but because nothing in his lifetime had prepared him for it. He slowly stood to his feet. Not out of confidence. Out of instinct. The kind of instinct that whispers, you've already gone too far. The psychologist broke the silence. What did you see? The psychic didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question no one expected. Has anyone here ever betrayed him? The room instantly became uncomfortable. Nobody spoke. Not because they didn't know. Because several people did. One investigator cleared his throat. What does that have to do with anything? The psychic looked directly into his eyes. Everything. He walked back toward the table. Not to continue the reading, but to understand why the room itself suddenly felt different. His hands were still shaking. Not violently. Just enough that he couldn't hide it anymore. I've spent my entire life reading people. I know what fear feels like. I know what anger feels like. I know grief, guilt, shame. I've stood in rooms filled with hatred. I've never confused those emotions. He paused, then quietly added, this isn't any of them. The investigators exchanged uneasy looks. One of them finally asked, so what is it? The psychic lowered his voice. It feels protective. Nobody expected that answer. Protection? Against whom? There was no danger inside the room. No weapons, no threats, nothing unusual. Yet somehow, the atmosphere carried the unmistakable feeling that someone had crossed a line they weren't supposed to cross. The psychologist tried bringing the conversation back to logic. Maybe you're projecting. Perhaps you're emotionally overwhelmed. The psychic smiled. Not because the suggestion was ridiculous, because it was exactly what he would have said years ago. If this were emotion, I could explain it. If this were imagination, I could control it. But this, he looked down at your belonging resting quietly on the table. This reacts. The room became still again. He slowly reached into his bag. Not for another card. Not for another pendulum. This time, he removed an old notebook. Its pages were yellow, its corners worn from years of travel. Inside were hundreds of names, cases, observations, moments no one else had witnessed. He turned page after page, searching. Finally, he stopped. There have only been 3 times. 3, someone asked. He nodded. The first, I was young. I ignored every warning. I continued anyway. When I left, I couldn't sleep for almost 2 weeks. He turned another page. The second, I ended the session before it truly began. I told myself I'd never ignore that feeling again. Silence. Someone finally asked, and this. He closed the notebook. This is worse. No one laughed anymore. Even the skeptic sitting near the back had stopped taking notes. Because regardless of personal belief, everyone could see one undeniable truth. The man sitting before them wasn't acting. His fear wasn't theatrical. It wasn't exaggerated. It was honest. The kind of honesty people reveal only when they're no longer trying to impress anyone. He looked toward the object again, then quietly whispered, I don't think I'm supposed to be here. The investigator frowned. What do you mean? The psychic answered without looking up. I don't think this reading was ever meant to happen. The room suddenly felt smaller, not physically, psychologically. Every person present felt it. The strange pressure, the growing awareness that curiosity had quietly transformed into intrusion. One assistant nervously laughed. So, you're saying something doesn't want you reading him? The psychic slowly shook his head. No, it isn't stopping me. It simply isn't allowing me further. The difference sounded small, yet somehow, it changed everything. He wasn't describing resistance. He was describing authority. The kind that never raises its voice because it doesn't have to. He stared toward the same empty corner again. This time, his expression softened, almost respectfully. Then, without warning, he quietly said, I understand. Everyone looked confused. Understand what? A no answer. Only silence. Almost as though the conversation happening wasn't with them anymore. Nearly a full minute passed before he spoke again. You've survived something, he whispered. Something that should have destroyed you. The psychologist immediately interrupted. We already know he experienced trauma. The psychic shook his head. No, you know events. I'm talking about transformation? He leaned forward. There are moments in life When a person doesn't simply recover, they become someone entirely different. Not stronger, not colder, different. He looked around the room. You've been studying the version that survived. You've completely ignored the version that was born afterward. Silence. That sentence landed heavier than anyone expected, because suddenly every inconsistency, every contradiction, every failed profile made sense. Not because they finally understood you, but because they realized they had been asking the wrong questions from the beginning. The psychic slowly stood, gathering his notebook, closing his bag, sliding the object gently back across the table. The investigator immediately stopped him. "You're leaving." He nodded. "But you haven't finished a note." He looked directly into their eyes. "I've finished enough. What about the answers?" The psychic smiled sadly. "You came here looking for answers. What you actually found was a boundary." He walked toward the door, his footsteps slow, measured, almost respectful. One hand reached the doorknob, then, without turning around, he spoke one final sentence. "The greatest mistake people make is believing every mystery exists to be solved." He opened the door, paused, and quietly added, "Some mysteries exist to remind human beings where their understanding ends." He walked away, not hurried, not terrified, just certain. Certain that if he stayed another minute, he would begin asking questions no human mind was prepared to answer. Behind him, no one spoke, no one moved, because for the first time since the investigation began, they no longer wanted proof, they wanted distance. Yet none of them realized the real story had only just begun, because the psychic hadn't discovered your secret. He had merely discovered that someone, or something, had been protecting it all along. The room remained silent long after the psychic disappeared down the hallway. No one rushed after him. No one demanded another explanation. It wasn't because they had finally found the answers they wanted. It was because they realized they had been asking the wrong questions from the very beginning. For months they had tried to discover what made you different. Now, they found themselves wondering why they had become so obsessed with proving you were different in the first place. The psychologist stared at the empty chair where the psychic had been sitting. His notebook was still open. Every page contained observations, patterns, theories, predictions, hours of professional analysis, yet none of it felt complete anymore. Not because the information was wrong, but because it had only described behavior. It had never touched identity. There is a difference. People spend their entire lives explaining what someone does, without ever understanding who they became because of what they survived. That was their mistake. They kept studying your reactions, instead of the battles that created them. They measured your silence, without asking what noise had taught you the value of silence. They questioned your boundaries, without asking who had forced you to build them. The investigator slowly closed your file. For the first time, he wasn't looking for evidence against you. He was looking for evidence against his own assumptions. Every interview replayed inside his mind. Every conversation, every contradiction. Suddenly, none of those contradictions felt contradictory anymore. Kind people had seen kindness. Manipulative people had seen resistance. Honest people felt comfortable around you. Dishonest people felt exposed. Perhaps people had never been describing you at all. Perhaps they had been describing themselves. Because human beings rarely see others exactly as they are. They see others through the condition of their own minds. A fearful person finds danger everywhere. An insecure person mistakes confidence for arrogance. A dishonest person assumes everyone else is hiding something. Your presence had never forced anyone to reveal themselves. It simply gave them enough silence to hear themselves. That realization hit the room harder than any psychic reading ever could. One assistant finally whispered, "So, he wasn't afraid of this person?" The psychologist slowly shook his head. "No, he was afraid of misunderstanding them." Another long silence followed. Then someone quietly repeated the sentence that had changed everything. "No human should have this kind of power." At first, it sounded supernatural, almost impossible. But now, the words carried an entirely different meaning. Maybe the psychic hadn't been talking about magic. Maybe he had been talking about a kind of inner strength that most people never develop. The strength born from surviving betrayal without becoming cruel. The strength born from carrying pain without making pain your identity. The strength to remain calm while everyone else desperately tries to provoke you. That kind of power cannot be measured. It cannot be borrowed. It cannot be purchased. It is earned one difficult decision at a time. Most people think power is loud. They imagine shouting, control, dominance, winning arguments, being feared. Real power usually looks nothing like that. Real power is remaining peaceful inside chaos. It is refusing revenge when revenge feels justified. It is walking away from manipulation instead of proving yourself. It is protecting your mind from people who profit from your confusion. That kind of power makes insecure people uncomfortable. Not because it attacks them, but because it exposes everything they haven't healed. Perhaps that was the real reason every expert struggled. Not because you couldn't be understood, but because understanding someone like you required confronting themselves first. And that is something many people spend their entire lives avoiding. The investigator looked through the window. The sun was beginning to disappear beyond the horizon. He smiled quietly, almost embarrassed. "We were trying to solve a mystery," he said. "When all we really found was a lesson." No one argued, because everyone felt it. The room had changed, not physically, mentally. The need to label you, judge you, control you, had disappeared. It had been replaced with something much rarer, respect, not the kind demanded through fear, the kind earned through quiet consistency. Hours later, the building was empty. The lights were switched off one by one. Your file remained on the table. No longer marked as dangerous, no longer marked as unexplained. Only one sentence remained written across the final page. Some people cannot be understood by forcing them into categories. They can only be understood by becoming wiser ourselves. And maybe that is the lesson most people never learn. We spend so much energy trying to explain extraordinary people, when we should be asking what ordinary thinking keeps us from seeing. Because every once in a while, you meet someone whose greatest strength isn't intelligence, or influence, or talent. It's awareness. The ability to remain centered while the world loses itself. The ability to recognize manipulation without becoming manipulative. The ability to survive heartbreak without surrendering compassion. That isn't supernatural, it is simply rare. And rare things often appear mysterious to those who have never experienced them. So if people constantly misunderstand you, if they keep projecting stories onto your silence, if they become uncomfortable simply because you refuse to play their games, don't waste your life shrinking yourself to fit their expectations. Keep protecting your peace. Keep strengthening your character. Keep choosing wisdom over reaction. Because the people who fear your calm are often fighting storms inside themselves. The psychic never returned. Not because he had been defeated, but because he understood something many never will. Not every person is meant to be conquered. Not every mystery is meant to be explained. Sometimes, the greatest display of wisdom is knowing where curiosity should end and respect should begin. If this story made you think differently about human behavior, emotional strength, and the quiet power of self-mastery, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Because in a world obsessed with becoming louder, the rarest power is becoming unshakable.